Chapter 24. In the Palace. In a barren cell somewhere below the palace, Indy hovered on the border of sleep. He saw the eagle flapping its wings, soaring high above him. Then Mandrake's face obliterated the eagle. The colonel smiled cruelly, then pointed the barrel of his gun in his face. Indy jerked awake, pounded the hard mattress, and turned over. He knew that what had happened to him in the crevice had been more than a dream, but he didn't want to think about it. Didn't want to give it meaning, because all he could see was death, his death obliterating his future. He turned over again, trying to stop his thoughts, but couldn't do it for more than a few seconds. He counted backward from 100, 99, 98. He made it to 85 before the numbers muddled in his mind and he drifted. 86, 78. He slept. He blinked his eyes open. Something had jarred him from his sleep. He listened. He heard breathing. Shannon and Conrad, but another noise had awakened him. He heard it again. Hollow, distant voices, growing closer. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. He heard a jingle of keys. A voice like gravel growled. Another grunted in response. Now what? The door opened. In the dim light from the hall, he saw two uniformed guards enter the cell. They looked around. One pointed at Indy, and the other immediately jerked him from the floor. "What's going on?" Shannon shouted as Indy was dragged towards the door. "Where are you taking him?" Conrad asked. He stood, but he was pushed back down. The door slammed shut. Hope this isn't the execution call, Indy thought. "Is it morning already?" he asked in Greek as he was led away. The guards didn't answer. No one had told the prisoners anything. They'd been fed soup, bread, and water, and given a blanket and a thin mattress apiece. But they're pleased to see the king or anyone who would listen to them were met with silence. In fact, they didn't even know the whereabouts of Nikos. They hadn't seen him since they left the car, and Indy hoped that somehow in the confusion he had managed to escape. They reached a stairway, and the guards literally ran him up the steps. "Hey, boys, what's the rush?" He was ushered into a back hallway. He glimpsed a huge kitchen off the hall where men in white uniforms scrubbed the floor. He smelled the faint odor of food. "Oh, time for breakfast already?" The guards' sullen expressions remained intact. "Guess not." They kept walking, and soon they entered another hallway, but this one was ornate, suitable for a palace. His feet sank into the plush carpeting. The walls were mahogany, and the cornices were trimmed with gold leaf. He had no doubt that he was now in the main part of the palace. Halfway down the hallway, they stopped in front of double doors tall enough for a giant to enter without ducking. One of the guards tapped lightly. Immediately, the door opened a couple of inches. A few words were exchanged. Then Indy was escorted into a library filled with books that reached from floor to ceiling. The royal library, he thought, like in my dream vision. A large, muscular man in a suit pointed to a wooden chair, and Indy sat down. He looked up glumly at the man, expecting an interrogation session. But why in a library? Maybe he was going to beat him to death with books. Joyce's Ulysses could kill him with a single blow. "Hello, Mr. Indiana Jones." Indy looked around and saw the king step into view. He was wearing a blue satin robe and slippers, just like in the vision, and he limped slightly as he walked. "Your Highness." Indy stood up, but the guard shoved him back into his chair. The king lowered himself into a swivel chair in front of a fireplace. "I'm talking to you against the wishes of my advisors. They thought I should expel you from the country without another word." Really? It was the best news Indy had heard since they'd left Delphi. "I'm sure my friends and I will accept that, but—" The king raised a hand, cutting him off. "The reason I've decided to talk to you is that I feel I owe you at least that. You saved my life." I feel very fortunate to be here with you. The king laughed. You are fortunate to be alive, much less in the palace. If the reports I received were accurate, luck must be on your side. Indy tried to answer, but his throat was dry and his voice cracked. The king snapped his fingers and murmured something to a man who had been hidden by the bookshelves. Indy looked around, wondering how many other people were in the room. A moment later, the aide handed Indy a glass of water. Now, tell me why you stole an artifact from Delphi and an automobile from Colonel Mandrake. Indy gulped the water down and cleared his throat. Mandrake was going to kill you. I mean, he wanted me to kill you. Wait, the king interrupted. Start from the beginning. Why did you go to Delphi with Dorian Bellacamus? Indy told his story, starting with his first encounter with Dorian. He told the king everything, from her ploy to become Pythia to the story of Richard Farnsworth. He hoped all the details would make his story about the assassination plot more believable. The king listened closely, expressing astonishment at Bellacamus's double dealings. No wonder the miracle vapors didn't work. The cure didn't last any longer than the new Pythia. He asked about Stephanos Dumas, and Indy told him that the dead archaeologist had been involved in the Order of Pythia, but not in the assassination attempt. So you say that this supposed attempt to kill me had nothing to do with this mystical order, but was a military plot led by Colonel Mandrake? Indy nodded. The king looked distracted. I'm well aware that my political enemies are growing in numbers, and that everything has not worked out as I hoped. But until now, none of them has attempted to kill me. He turned to Indy and smiled. If what you say about Mandrake is true, I don't feel so bad now about his car being destroyed. He got up and hobbled over to the fireplace. He rubbed his hands together over the low burning fire, then turned to Indy. I'd like to offer you and your friends a choice of staying in the palace as my guests of honor, or leaving and doing as you please. I think I can speak for my friends and say that the three of us are ready to go back to Paris. Then he asked about Nikos. The king glanced to the side, and the aide who had brought the water appeared again. The man watched Indy as the king spoke under his breath. He said something back to the king. Then, after another exchange, the aide moved away. I'm sorry, Mr. Jones, the king said, but we know nothing about the boy. I hope he was able to get out of the car. Are you saying he never got out? Indy raised his voice, and the guard by the door took a couple of steps towards him until the king motioned that it was okay. I'm saying I don't know. If I knew he was dead, I would tell you. The aide returned carrying the knapsack and handed it to the king, who offered it to Indy. I believe this is yours. Incredible. He's going to give me the Omphalos, Indy thought. Again, just like the vision. He shook his head. No, it's not mine. It's the Omphalos. It belongs to everyone. It seems that there has been more attention given to this stone than it deserves, the king said. I'm not so sure about that, your highness. The king reached into the knapsack and scooped out the cone with one hand. Dr. Bellacamus, for all her faults, is an authority on Delphi, and she told me that the Omphalos is really nothing more than a curiosity, a meteorite, actually. I'm sure if it was of great value, she wouldn't have left the palace without it. I'd like you to take it as a memento of your trip. Your Highness, I think you should put it back in the knapsack. If it's held too long, it may... You may... Indy didn't know how to explain it. He really didn't believe it, but something had happened to him, and to Dorian. I don't see anything unusual about it, the king turned it over in his hands. It feels warm. He folded down into his chair. I feel a little drowsy. The knapsack dropped to the floor as he wrapped his arms around the Omphalos. For several seconds he was motionless. Then his eyes grew wide, his mouth twisted in the expression of shock, and Indy knew that the artifact was working its spell. He rushed forward, but the burly guard caught him before he reached the king. Do something, Indy barked. Can't you see he needs help? Get the stone! The aide moved to the king's side, asked if he was okay. Carefully, he lifted the omphalos and set it on the floor. "The doctor! Quickly!" he yelled. The king raised his hand. "No, I'm okay." He ran his hands over his face. "Release him," he told the guard, who still held Indy. "I'm sorry, Your Highness. I tried to warn you." The king stared down at the omphalos. "I had the strangest experience. It was like a dream, but I was awake. I was surrounded by horrendous army ants, and they were picking at me. They were trying to carry me away." Indy nodded, uncertain what to say. "What happened to me?" "I don't know," Indy said. "I think the artifact needs to be carefully studied by scientists." "It needs to be locked away," the king retorted. "Or maybe lost again." A beat passed. "Well, if you're going to make the ferry on time, you better be on your way." As the king accompanied him to the door of the library, Indy thought that there was something different about him now, but he wasn't sure what it was. He thanked the king for his help. "Thank you for yours. Now I have some army ants to deal with this morning." With that, he turned and walked away. As the door closed behind Indy, he realized what it was about the king. He no longer limped. The city was just coming awake as they walked out a side door of the palace and headed towards the street. A church bell pealed. A rooster crowed. The clatter of a horse and buggy contrasted with the rumble of a car engine. "I can't believe we're getting out of this nightmare alive," Shannon said. As they reached the street, a soldier with a rifle approached them. "Now what?" Indy said warily. The soldier pointed to a new Cadillac waiting at the curb. "Your ride to the port." As he closed the door after them, Indy couldn't help commenting on the irony. "That guy was probably ready to kill us yesterday." "He's only doing his job," Conrad said. "Yeah, just following the score," Shannon said. "And what are we doing?" Indy asked. "Playing it by ear." "It's more interesting that way," Indy said. "To some people," Conrad responded. He stared out the window towards the palace with a look of longing. "It would have been nice to stay at the palace for a few days. I might have gotten inspired for my novel." Indy looked over at him as the car pulled away. "What about everything that's happened to you in the last few days?" "Experiences are deceptive, Indy. A writer is much better off working from the material of his inner self rather than from confusing experiences." Indy mulled over that a moment. "If you ask me, people are confusing, not experiences." Conrad didn't answer, and they were each left with his thoughts. As they passed the remains of Hadrian's library and neared the Roman Forum, Indy gazed out at the refugee shanties that were built on top of the ruins. Smoke was curling from a few rooftops and reminded him of the vapors rising from the crevice in Apollo's temple. Then he saw her moving through the gray dawn, her long hair tied in a braid. There was no doubt in his mind that it was Dorian Bellacamus. "Stop!" "What are you doing?" Shannon asked as Indy opened the door. "We've got to get to Piraeus." "Listen, wait 5 minutes for me. If I'm not back, go on. I'll meet you at the ferry. There's something I've got to do." "We don't have much time," Conrad warned. I know." He slammed the door without another word and hurried past a hodgepodge of shanties. She had been headed in that direction, and he thought he knew her destination. He passed the ancient gate to the Forum, continued a ways, then saw the Tower of Winds. She stood beneath it, gazing upward. Dorian stared intently at the face of Lips, the southwest wind, who was speeding along the voyage of a ship. Jones and the others would soon be gone. The danger was over. And yet she felt empty. She would miss Jones. She had truly enjoyed his company, something he would never believe. He wouldn't understand the complexity of her life and how forces beyond her personal life were directing her. She also knew that even if she had succeeded in breaking away from Mandraki and becoming Pythia, it would not have been any different. Those same political forces still would have driven her, and her fantasy about herself and Jones in the seat of power would have failed. She didn't know what her future was. Maybe she would return to Paris. Maybe not. Nothing would be resolved until Mandraki acted. Her life was not really hers, and she detested that. Now I know why this is your favorite ruin. She spun around, startled. Indy! You're just like it. Different faces for different winds. What are you doing here? On my way back to Paris. Just saying ADO. She glanced around. Mandraki was inspecting the refugee situation, and he would meet her here any time. You shouldn't be here. Fidgeting. He laughed. Now you're telling me to get lost. I'm not leaving until you've satisfied my curiosity. Why did Mandraki take you back after you shot him? He doesn't exactly seem like the forgiving type. She knew he wouldn't go away until she answered. He didn't know who shot him. You can see through the vapors better than you can see into them. He only heard me call his name. That figures. You deceived him just like you did me and probably every other man in your life. And I thought for a while that I loved you. She met his cold stare. I'm not really a bad person, Indy. I do what I have to do. But you're a man. You wouldn't understand. He shook his head. Your gender has nothing to do with it. If every woman were like you, we'd all be in. Just go. Please. But it was too late. Mandraki stood just 5 feet away, and he was raising a revolver. The gun seemed to move in slow motion. This couldn't be happening. The vision couldn't be true. What about all the adventures? And his entire future? Or the lack of it, depending on whether or not he left the car to follow Dorian? Jones, you're dead. No, Dorian yelled, and she stepped between them. Get out of my way, Dorian, now! No, you aren't going to kill him. Move out of the way! You'll have to kill me first. Damn you, Dorian! The gun fired. Indy caught Dorian as she collapsed. He felt the warmth of her blood seeping through his shirt and heard the soft, terrible wheezing as she tried to pull air into her lungs. He knew Mandraki was still standing there with the gun as he placed Dorian gently on the ground. He elevated her head so she wouldn't drown in her own blood. Dorian, Mandraki whimpered. I didn't mean it. The gun just fired. She tried to speak, but couldn't. She tried to lift her hand, but couldn't do that either. Indy bent over her, touched her cheek. Get away from her, Mandraki yelled. You did this. You killed her. Now you're dead. Indy looked up into the barrel of the gun, just like the vision. So this was it. He heard a gunshot. Mandraki staggered a couple of steps. Malaka, he cursed, and he dropped to the ground. Indy recognized the guard from the king's library, standing in the clearing. As the guard moved toward them, Indy saw Mandraki lift his weapon and aim at him again. But the guard was ready. He pumped several shots into him. The gun fell from Mandraki's hand. Blood oozed from his mouth. This time he wouldn't get up. When Indy looked down at Dorian, she was dead. Her eyes gazed vacantly at the blue morning sky overhead. Oddly, he knew he was going to miss her. In spite of her shortcomings, she had influenced his life. He would never be the same person again, and he knew that he had found the career that would be his life's work. He brushed a hand across Dorian's cheek, then closed the lids of her eyes. Indy, are you all right? Nikos, what are you doing here? Nikos glanced anxiously around. I hid in the palace garden all night. Then I saw you leaving in the car. I followed you in a taxi because I wanted to say goodbye. I've got to get to the ferry. Come on, the taxi's waiting. You can still make it. He glanced once more at Dorian's frozen expression and turned away. The ferry's horn blasted as they arrived at the port. He shook hands with Nikos and thanked him for his help. Come visit me in Paris. I want to go to America, too, and see a jazz band and the Grand Canyon, Nikos called after him. Why not? Indy said, and smiled. Then he strode up the gangway. The horn blasted one final time, and the gangway rose behind him. As the ferry edged away from the pier, Indy heard another horn. It was Shannon playing his cornet on the deck. He strolled over to him, nodding to Conrad. Shannon blew a few more bluesy notes, then lowered the horn. You just made it, Indy. What the hell were you doing? I'll tell you later. We got plenty of time to talk. But what was that tune? Don't think I've ever heard it. That's because you've only ever seen the lyrics. It's called Down in the Quarter. Still need a singer, but at least I've got a new verse. He snapped his fingers, then tapped a beat on his cornet. Took a trip to Greece, left the quarter far behind. But Lord never know how I'd miss that second home of mine. My sentiments too, Indy said. Got something for you, Conrad said, and he handed Indy a package. It arrived just before you got here. What's this? Indy ripped open the envelope attached to the top of the package and saw it was a note from the king. Dear Mr. Jones, I hope you will change your mind and accept the Omphalos. Bury it at sea if you wish, but please take it far from Greece and Delphi. The days of Apollo's oracle are long over, and we Greeks must look to our future rather than try to revive our distant past. Thank you. What is it? Shannon asked as the ferry pulled away from the pier. A piece of a falling star, I guess. Indy balanced the package on the railing. What are you going to do with it? He looked down at the dark blue sea. I don't know. I'll have to think about it. But I know a museum curator in Chicago who would be very pleased to have it in his Greek collection. And that's the end of the novel. There is an About the Author section. It says, Rob McGregor wrote Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, a novel based on the movie script. He is also the author of The Crystal Skull, a novel of adventure and intrigue, and The Rainbow Oracle with Tony Grosso, a book of color divination. His travel articles have appeared in the Miami Herald, Los Angeles Times, Boston Globe, Newsday, and elsewhere. He is also a contributor to Omni Magazine's Antimatter section. Besides his work as a writer, he has organized adventure tours to South America for travel writers and led the first group of U.S. journalists to the lost city of the Sierra Nevada of Santa Marta Mountains in Colombia in 1987. He lives in Boynton Beach, Florida, where he is at work on his next novel. I thank you guys for indulging me on taking a detour on reading an Indiana Jones novel. I hope you guys liked it. I'd be interested in hearing what you guys thought of it in the comments. There were several Indiana Jones novels. I think the first 4 or 5 of them were written by Rob McGregor. There were other novels that were written by other authors. They're all of varying quality. I have never really considered the novels canon. I do consider the movies, except for Dial of Destiny, the Young Indiana Jones TV series, and the games to be canon, although there's a little bit of continuity problems slightly created by the most recent release, which was The Great Circle. I'm sure I'll eventually talk about that a little bit. I think there are ways to resolve some of the issues there, but it will take a little bit of headcanon to make that work. In any case, let me know what you all thought. I will probably be going back to Star Wars. I noticed that I did have a bit of a viewership dip while doing Indiana Jones, and so I guess maybe some of you aren't as into Indy as you are Star Wars, but I'd still be interested to hear what you thought. Hope you guys did enjoy the book. I'll talk to you all real soon.